Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next panel, Energy, Volatility, Viability, and What It Means for American Exporters. Our moderator, Heather Zeichel, Senior Fellow, Global Energy Center, Atlantic Council. She is joined by the panelists, Borja Negro, CEO, North America, Gamesir, Doug Oberhelman, Chairman of the Board of Directors and CEO, Caterpillar, Stephen Politz, Governor, Bank of Canada, and Jim Rogers, retired Chairman of the Board, Duke Energy.
Ron's age and declining health is doing well. No, I know.
Voice of God is working.
I've so much enjoyed you.
Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. We're very excited to have our panelists speak on global challenges and trends in the energy market. Obviously, as we join you here today, we have a very different picture on energy than I think many people in this room would have predicted in 2008. We have crude at less than $60. We have renewables capturing larger and larger share of the market. The U.S. shale revolution has scrambled traditional assumptions about the global energy picture. And the role of technology and innovation is driving down costs on a nearly yearly basis. Here to talk with us today about these issues is Mr. Borja Negro, the CEO of North America, Gamesa, Doug Oberhelman, Chairman of the Board of Directors and CEO of Caterpillar, Governor Stephen Politz, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and Mr. Jim Rogers, Chairman of the Board of Duke Energy. I'd like to start this morning with a question for you, Mr. Negro. As you are thinking about your business perspective and the wind industry, thinking about 2014, it was a global year for the wind industry. For the first time, you hit the 50 gigawatt mark. Obviously very exciting. So as you think about the future, where do you see some of the opportunities?
Heather, thank you for the introduction. So I think the biggest challenge the world has in terms of energy is probably giving access to electricity to those 1.2 billion people that still don't have. At the same time, we need to provide a response to all those countries with very fast-growing middle classes and that are demanding growth of energies of around 15 or 20%. And finally, we need to fight climate change. For us, a renewable company, we think a big part of the response to that, and the markets that have those needs are India, a lot of Asian countries, some countries in Latin America, and that will be the focus of our efforts. And the opportunity is there because those countries and the world today needs energy that is first competitive, and renewables is very competitive. Wind is in some regions the most competitive source of energy without any subsidies. Also, we need price certainty, and we know that the cost of the fuel in wind and solar will be zero for a 25-year or 40-year facility. We also need to protect the environment, and we also need speed in the installation of those energy facilities. A wind farm can get built, a 200 megawatt wind farm in just 8 or 9 months after start of construction will be generating electricity. So I think that's a great opportunity for wind, is a great opportunity for renewables to respond to that huge need.
So switching gears a little bit, so much of the conversation in energy policy circles is about the price of crude and what all that impacts. Mr. Oberhelman, how do you see the decline in price of oil affecting your business?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you over here very well.
Oh, sorry. How do you see the decline in the price of oil affecting your business?
Yeah, thank you. And I very much appreciate being here with you and the panel as well. The price of oil for Caterpillar has been a real headwind, and it will be in 2015. We have an energy and transportation business segment that's about a $22 billion segment, and our oil and gas piece of that is an important part of that. It's not the biggest part of that by far, but within that we break down into oil supply, which is kind of land-based well servicing, pad preparation for oil sites, drilling and fracking, and then we have a fairly substantial gas piece as well, which is primarily gas compression, which as you turn on your flame on your stove, the pressure behind that flame is kind of what our equipment does. It supplies the pressure through the pipelines from the wellhead to the point of use. So in our case this year, it's about oil fracking. We lowered our forecast about 10%, about $5 billion, 2014 over 15, about half of that's oil fracking. We do that in two ways. Site preparation, we use a bulldozer generally and a motor grader, maybe one other piece of equipment to prepare a flat site. They typically put gravel or some kind of smooth surface over that, and they come in and do their drilling with a fracturing complex, which includes a number of very large Caterpillar engines and pumps to supply high pressure down the hole to actually frack and break up the shale. Obviously, as that business has plummeted, so have our sales to the frac sites, and that's primarily the way it helps us. The other side of this, however, is every one of our products uses diesel fuel, and the price of diesel fuel has declined by about half over the last year, which is a benefit to a lot of the users of our equipment. I think that therein is a major stimulus to the world, particularly to the North American economy, that will work its way through eventually, and we're seeing some of that in some places. So for us, it's a double-edged sword. It's a little sharper sword at the beginning, and this year, later on, it'll be the other side of that.
So picking up on that, Governor, from a Canadian perspective, how do you think about the changing price of crude and how your economy is adapting to that?
Well, sure, thanks. Delighted to be here, by the way. It's a great conference. This drop in oil prices is a very significant shock for the Canadian economy. Oil exports constitute about 6% of our GDP, and what's happened in the last 6 months is the value of those exports have been cut in half. So it's like a 3% pay cut for the whole country. Of course, it's not spread evenly, at least not at first, but eventually it spreads almost everywhere, either upstream, in the case of canceled investments, of the sorts of things that you're talking about. Something like a third of all the investment in Canada each year is in the oil and gas sector, and those companies are cutting by around 30 or 40%, that kind of thing. So it's a very big hit to the bottom line. And also downstream, so as there are layoffs in that sector, somebody who was planning to replace their vehicle this year now won't replace their vehicle, so there are layoffs related to that in various other supply sectors. So the good news, though, is that we think it's a very front-loaded, a one-time kind of shock. It sets up adjustments in the economy, that there's a lot of positives that come a little bit further down the road, and that's what we're looking for. Actually, starting in the second quarter, we think the positives will be more important than the negatives, and certainly in the second half of this year, this shock should be fully behind us.
So we've heard about the impacts of changing crude prices and low crude prices. The other area and segment of the economy that is really seeing a lot of transformation is the utility sector. Everybody is talking about what's the new business model for the utility sector in the future and what's driving that. Can you speak to some of that, Mr. Rogers?
Sure. Heather, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I would start by simply saying that shale revolution in the United States, the falling cost of renewables, solar and wind, are really transforming how we generate electricity in the United States. If you go back 5 years, it was almost 50% of electricity came from coal. Now it's about 39%. You see an increase in renewables, increase in gas, and nuclear is holding steady at basically 19%. Well, it's only 19%. It's 64% of our carbon-free electricity. So climate change is going to play a key role. The transition is going to be driven by a couple key facts. One key fact is that virtually every power plant in this country, except hydro, will be retired and replaced by 2050. So we almost have what I'd call a virtual blank sheet of paper. And so the question is, what do we build? And what we build has implications around the world is other economies, I think Europe specifically, are going through similar transitions with probably a little more emphasis on green than there is in the U.S. at this moment. So this 2050 need to retire and replace is really going to drive significant investment and change the mix from where it is today. I would predict that coal will continue to fall, gas will rise, although we have to be careful to avoid all gas all the time for a variety of reasons. The second thing I would say is the demand for electricity. Now we're living in a world, what I call the new normal, where growth is only 2 to 2.5% in the U.S., the economy. But you see a decoupling of the demand of electricity from the growth of the economy. So we see the demand is basically flattish to maybe declining in the future. That has an implication for the regulatory model of utilities in the U.S. So I think at the end of the day, you're going to see a fundamental change in the regulatory model. It's going to happen state by state in the United States. And as a consequence of that, the role of the utility will not just be a seller of kilowatt hours, as they've historically been. They will be making significant investments in energy efficiency or productivity gains in the use of electricity, significant investment in converting the grid from an analog to digital grid. So we have the capability to handle rooftop, solar on the rooftop. Ultimately, the role of the utility, and they'll be compensated for this, is the optimization of electricity, the use of electricity, all the way from solar on the rooftop, central station plants, all the way to the device, because we're fast moving into the world of the Internet of everything. Every device will have an Internet address. So that's the new world that we're moving into.
So, Mr. Negro, obviously, Mr. Rogers has painted a really interesting picture of both flat demand, but also greater potential for renewables. As you think about the impediments to increasing wind power, what are your primary concerns? What do you see as the biggest impediments out there?
Okay, probably, and if we think especially about foreign markets, about export, the primary concern is regulation. Sometimes some markets are very protective with local suppliers or require a lot of local content. Sometimes there is unstable policy, which links with lack of financing or expensive financing, and there Exim obviously plays a key role in trying to help those projects to happen. Second, we need to keep lowering the cost of energy, of renewables. So it's gone down about 50-60% for the last 5 years, but we need to continue that trend through innovation. Another challenge, a big challenge, is the lack of transmission. We're talking about all those rural, remote areas where people don't have access to electricity and where the national grid doesn't even reach those villages. How can we build energy facilities? How can we electrify those villages without that grid? Well, we're working on that, obviously, because the challenge is great, but the opportunity is phenomenal. There, for example, renewables can be combined with storage systems so that we can have even off-grid systems, and we can overcome that lack of transmission. I would say those are the main challenges. In the past, we've been very linked to the price of oil. That trend is changing. We are less and less dependent on oil fluctuation. And see in the last 6 months or 8 months, where the oil has dropped by 51%. If you see an average of the publicly traded renewable companies, they have almost not been affected. There's a variety of reasons for that, but in reality, electricity generated by oil is a very small part of the market, 5%, and really oil would need to be at $23 to compete with wind. So I think that's an important trend.
So, Mr. Oberhelman, obviously building off of the discussion around renewables, how does your company think about and approach other types of energy sources, including renewables?
We have several things going on. I just visited one of our proving grounds out in Arizona where we're taking a mining truck that will haul 250 tons of ore, coal, aggregate, whatever it is. These are typically used in very big mines around the world for all kinds of commodities. And it's always been a diesel engine, so burning diesel fuel. And we now have a lot of, at this stage, late experimentation, almost commercialized conversion kits to LNG. And there are obviously a huge demand for that. The problem is, of course, we just lost the edge with the fuel price dropping in half. But there's still a demand for many miners and sites around the world that have their own natural gas, and many do, and it's easy to refill. So that's an exciting program, and we're going to invest in that because long-term that will pay off. We're also doing an awful lot of work, and one that's kind of fun. It's not a big market, but we've supplied standby generator sets fueled by diesel with a solar panel to villages in Africa and places where there's a lot of sun. And maybe at night, obviously, there's no sun, there's not a battery storage, so the diesel kicks in, and we can supply electricity to an awful lot of people very inexpensively and in a very environmentally friendly way. And I'd say the other area that's really the biggest that we're working on is something that is known as combined heat and power around our big reciprocating diesel and gas engines and around our industrial gas turbines. Typical reciprocating engine or turbine is somewhere between 40 and 50% efficient is all. That's about as good as it gets. But when we combine harnessing the heat loss off that, you can imagine a turbine, which is essentially a jet engine, and the amount of heat it generates. We harness that heat, we more than double the efficiency of that package. And that's a way in which a lot of utilities are going today and a lot of other big power users are going, and we can really step up the efficiency of that equipment at that time. And there's an awful lot of demand for that around the world. Then we're able to burn all kinds of alternative gases that are available. Landfill, for example, a lot of methane that's going to escape anyway. We can harness it and create power. So we have quite an alternative program going a little bit differently than you'd think about renewables, typically solar and wind.
Right. So we talked about all the people on the globe that have lack of access to energy. We talked about some of the technology that Caterpillar can bring to bear to allow and to provide energy for those who aren't hooked to the grid. I know, Mr. Rogers, you have been giving a lot of thought to how do we tackle this energy challenge? How do we bring power to those who don't have it today? You're working on a book. Can you provide any insights that you've gleaned from your work there?
I think there's a number of impediments of bringing electricity to the 1.2 billion. I mean, probably the top impediment is government policies in countries. Most of the countries that have need for electrification in the rural areas have state-owned utilities. They put tariff on new equipment. If you're going to bring a Caterpillar genset in, there's probably a tariff on it. If you're going to bring solar panels in or solar lanterns in, or if you're going to build a microgrid. So all of that, there's a need for governments around the world, especially in the low-income countries, to basically change and reduce the impediments, but probably more importantly, to facilitate the deployment of capital in these rural areas. If you think about the future, can you imagine, I mean, just to make the case quickly, there's 1 billion people in the world that go to medical clinics without electricity. There are 50% of the people in developing countries that go to primary schools with no electricity. For them to catch up and to move ahead in the 21st century, it's really critical that we find a way to do it, to deploy the technologies. So if you get the government working to make it happen, I know the UN is thinking, and probably in September will announce that access to electricity is a sustainable development goal, which I think pushes governments to start to act on this. But then the financing will come if the structure is right within the country. Probably the most important thing is to be able to scale as the capability of people to pay scales. The big issue has always been, can you do this for profit? And with the fall in solar, I actually believe that solar will really make a difference, wind will make a difference. And if you build a microgrid in some of these villages, it brings, Doug's gen sets in to really be able to light up 24/7 a village of 500, 1,000, 2,000 people. So this is a pretty exciting thing for two reasons. One, the cost of renewables are coming down, and it allows for people to have access, and that transforms their lives. Probably more important in the 21st century than ever.
Right. So certainly an important role that governments play. Governor, what policies from your perspective can be put in place to address energy poverty?
Well, that's pretty far away from the central banking world, but I think that the primary thing, I think what the others are saying is that sometimes well-meaning policies have unintended consequences, and so a more fulsome analysis of those can be very helpful. So I know a Canadian company that builds LED road lighting systems, and they're able to go into a city and say, well, we'll replace all the lights and we'll finance it, and it will pay for itself in, say, 3 years. And after that, we save all the money you save on electricity is yours to keep. It's a great value proposition. But if they had just tried to sell them the lights, it would have been much harder. So it's the value proposition is totality, which matters to people. So in terms of policies here at home, it's more about reacting to the changes that we've seen. So companies are reacting, which is quite interesting, improving their efficiency. So in the oil sector, a lot of cost cutting that's happening. Companies tell me, oh, we replaced our whole system of valves. Valves, it doesn't sound very exciting, and yet 10, 12% reduction in costs for a facility. Those kinds of things really start to add up, and it's changing the whole nature of the oil supply curve. It's flexibility and how flat it is, I think. And so that will have a fundamental role to play in these alternative energies. But you also hear about the efficiency gains there too. So we're all better off with this stuff.
So clearly there's a lot of new innovation and technology that is coming to bear in the oil and gas sector as well as in the renewable sector. I was wondering if you could speak to what do you see from your vantage point at Gamesa? Are there a lot of new technology changes and opportunities for the wind sector, and if so, where might those lie?
Okay. There is a lot of innovation that is going on every day as we speak, and innovation is the key word to explain why renewables have been able to lower the cost and why we think they will keep going. In wind, for example, we were continuously looking for larger rotors to capture more efficiently wind, new aerodynamics, lighter materials in towers, also improvements during the operation and maintenance of the turbines to avoid downtimes, smart ways to interact with the grid, lowering the cost of integrations in the grid. And not only technology innovation, I think a big part of it is business integration. How do we lower the cost of capital? How we access more efficiently financing? So we have to rethink in some areas completely the way traditional business has been going on. So I think a lot of challenges that we have in front of us can be beaten with innovation, technological innovation, but we need to remain creative and find new ways to structure those projects.
So cost is a key driver. As you think about this from the utility sector, how much does this notion of or the challenge of energy poverty factor into a utility business model?
I think as a practical point, most utilities in the U.S. are sort of focused on their business here in the U.S. Only a few do business outside the U.S. I know for a fact that we have an operation in Latin America, and Latin America is uniquely blessed with about 50% of the electricity comes from hydro, and yet there's still 23 million people in Latin America with no access to electricity. They're predominantly in the Amazon areas and kind of remote areas in these countries. But I'm impressed with a couple things in Latin America specifically. One is the focus on reaching these 23 million, but there's also a great focus on renewables. For instance, in Brazil, there's been a huge effort, particularly given recent drought, to really focus on wind. Great opportunity for you there. But also, last year, there was over 600 megawatts of solar deployed. 2/3 of that was in Chile. And so you're starting to see, as notwithstanding the significant hydro that is there, which has zero carbon emissions, they're continuing to add and really changing their mix of generation going forward.
Okay. So obviously a lot of integration, and what happens in one country can impact the thinking in another. I was wondering, Governor, as we in the United States are dealing with a vastly changing energy picture, how does what's happening here impact your thinking and the policies in Canada, economically speaking as well?
Well, certainly the U.S. Remains and has always been our biggest customer, and certainly in energy, and not just in oil and gas, but we make blades for windmills and these kinds of things. So that we have a burgeoning business in a lot of renewables, solar, et cetera. So we always look to the U.S. as our number one customer, and who we want to serve. And of course, it's always in a context of what the rules are, what the policies are, and so on. So all that matters directly to us as a business proposition. So, I mean, how does it affect us? It affects us in every way, and it affects us exactly the same way as it affects companies in the United States. It's not actually, we're not special in that sense. So all of that, though, if you ask me, and given the what I've learned today, I mean, I'm actually very optimistic about this. I think the U.S. economy is doing really well, and in particular, the fact that the energy sector is going through a sort of a transformation with these different prices has probably got a lot of silver linings to it, and so indeed more likely to promote faster growth than slower growth, and so I think we all benefit from that. So I'm looking forward to it.
Mr. Oberhelman, do you agree? Do you look out, and do you have a lot of optimism from an economic perspective as well?
I am very optimistic, and technology is the answer here. This is Earth Day week, and I can remember not many years ago, acid rain.
Exactly.
Remember that one? Sulfur dioxide was killing our forests, the Northeast, and all on up into Canada. Yeah. And when was the last time we talked about sulfur dioxide and acid rain? We solved that through scrubber technology, Jim, which you would know, I don't know anything about, but I know it's there.
I spent a lot of money on it.
Yeah, but it solved the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the way through this. And technology has never ramped up fast. I can remember going to China not many years ago and would never see a solar panel. Today, every new building in China going up, and there are millions of them, all have solar panels on top, which has driven the cost down, has increased the level of technology for the rest of the world, and that's helping all of us. So to me, whether it's things that we do at Caterpillar, utilities do, or wherever it is, technology is the answer. And that'll be part of the solution around coal, because I agree completely with Jim. The amount of coal we're going to burn in this world will drop, but the world demand for energy is going to grow as 2 billion people come onto our planet in the next 20 years. So we are going to have to use all the sources that we possibly can, particularly in developing countries where they want to live like this. They want power and heat and the things we have. We can't cut them off from that.
Right.
And coal will be a part of that solution. In fact, I think the EPA numbers are leveling out about 30% down the road in a decade or so for the U.S., but it's going to be all of those, and technology is going to be a driver. And with the increasing rate of innovation and technology everywhere, I am really optimistic that who's ever up here 20 years from now have a lot of, think about 20 years ago, but have a very different view of things. It'll all be technologically advanced at that time.
Right.
Heather, if I may, picking up on Doug's theme here, if you look around the world, and you look at the technological changes that are occurring, it's remarkable. It's actually remarkable what the Chinese have done. They've lifted over 400 million people out of poverty. Yet today, they lead the world in solar panel production. They lead the world in wind turbine production. They're investing a lot in storage technologies, which I think is going to be transformative because I think they'll be embedded in the grid and change how we operate the grid of tomorrow. I think they're leading the way, and they have 30 new nuclear plants under construction. So they are really focused on the environmental implications of how they generate electricity. I think another great example, and there's some good aspects to this and bad aspects, and that's a quick look at Germany. I really applaud what the Germans have done as they move to more of a renewable portfolio. They've heavily subsidized renewables, although they're backing off the subsidies, appropriately so. They've been a leader, they've been a pioneer, but I guess I'd say, I lived in Texas for a while. We used to have a thing called the West Texas Rule. The West Texas Rule says pioneers get the arrows, settlers get the land. Okay? And so I think we need to think like settlers. And what are the lessons from Germany? One of the lessons is you don't go all in at the beginning as the cost of renewable is coming down. You feather in the solar, you feather in the wind. If you're serious about climate, you don't shut down your nuclear plants.
Right.
Because that's the only way we generate electricity 24/7. So they've shut down the nuclear plants. They've, because of subsidies, tripled the cost for residential consumers. And yet they're now using lignite coal, which is the dirtiest coal to use, and you see their emissions rising.
Right.
They will solve all this in time, but quite frankly, we in the US, with the challenge of retiring and replacing all our plants except hydro, by 2050, we should pay attention to that. And actually, I see a huge change, a drive to change technology in the US as a consequence of having to retire and replace our nuclear, as we move to the next generation, as we try to build new, more efficient gas plants, CHP, as Doug was saying. So I think the opportunities are huge, but we need to look around the world and pick the best from each, all from each other.
Right. But can we, oh, go ahead.
A quick note, we haven't talked much about hydro, but the Chinese right now are great designers and contractors of massive hydro projects around the world. South America, Africa, inside China. And it's going on very quietly, but there's probably more under construction today than there have ever been. And I would argue, and as some would, that that's a renewable resource. And a good one, but there's a lot of technology coming around that. Brazil's got some huge projects underway in the Amazon basin, controversially in every case, but it's a balance of what do we need versus how do we affect the environment.
Right. So a lot of people point to the example of the cell phone and the technology leap that it made in terms of bringing access to telephones to the underdeveloped countries. Is there a parallel here in the energy space, do you think?
I think there is. Well, there's two ways to think about the parallel. Think about if you're in Africa and 90% of the people have cell phones, and you see the emergence of mobile banking, which has been kind of, micro loans is much heralded, but has had its success has been limited. But I think this mobile banking creates credit history for people. But look at the interplay of solar, mobile banking, cell phones, storage technologies, the gensets from Caterpillar, and then all of a sudden you start to see how you're able to bring electricity to everybody within the country. The biggest impediment in a lot of these developing countries is really the banks. The banks won't loan longer than 5 to 7 years, and for most investments, whether you're building a microgrid, you're thinking in terms of 10 to 20 years. And so how do we fix that? How do we increase the equity? How do we get, how do you get the World Bank? How do you get OPEC? How do you get people more focused on not just central station plants, fossil-based all the time, but shifting more of their resources to renewables, especially in these remote areas?
think also a trend that is helping to or will help to have better access to financing is to have smaller facilities that go towards distributed generation. We will not have anymore in those rural areas big generating facilities of 300 megawatts. We'll more have 2-3 turbines with some solar panels, with some storage batteries that service a much smaller area. That deals much better with difficulties of access to financing. That deals much better with weak grids or absent grid, and in some cases with lack of infrastructures. We have to remember we have to transport blades that are 64 meters long to places that are remote, and we need to be able to do that in an efficient way.
Right. How big of an issue is access to financing?
Oh, I think so. But anyway.
Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Now, that's a central bank question.
Well, I agree.
Show me the money.
Epic fail.
Okay. Well, two points on this. First of all, access to financing of the sort you're describing is actually going through a low phase right now because globally we're all adjusting to new liquidity and capital rules. So I happen to think that over time that's going to go back to more normalization. But the sidebar to that is that one of the most important players in the space you're describing are the export credit agencies, such as U.S. Exim Bank. So when you have an industry that's trying to go global and the financing is a big issue for these kinds of installations, well, that's what export credit agencies most often do. And there's a perfect match there. It's a big gap in the market. That's what they do to fill gaps.
Right.
You know, just a quick point. The power sector is the most capital-intensive industry in the world.
Yeah.
And that's clearly true in the developed world, but in the developing world, it's true in the urban areas, but actually it's still the most capital-intensive industry in the rural areas. And the good news about solar, given where the price has gone and how storage is emerging, is that it's proving to be the affordable option versus building a central station plant, transmission and distribution into the rural areas. And it's doable now, not 10 years or 20 years from now. And at the same time, it is the cleanest way to provide electricity in these remote areas. In the sense of the word, to pick up on your earlier question, we're kind of leapfrogging the grid that we have in the US and we have in Europe and moving forward. Because a lot of people in developing worlds think that solar and wind are not first world ways to generate electricity. Mm-hmm. The truth of the matter is it's becoming first world.
Right.
And they have a chance to go without having to deal with an existing grid.
Right. So having worked in government myself, I know we're not always the quickest to change our thinking and react to the on-the-ground realities. How much of a challenge does this vastly changing energy picture pose for the way you think about your job on a day-to-day basis?
Well, speaking as an economist and central banker, what we're living in right now is the most complicated situation you can design for a central banker to have to deal with. It's one thing if it's a relatively small part of your economy, but in Canada it's a really big part. So it's good for part of the economy, and it's hard on another part of the economy. And the past 10 years, it's been the other way around, right? Rising energy prices. And so what's happened is big transformations take place in your economy, and now you start to, slow them down, and possibly some of them will reverse to a degree. That makes strong undercurrents in an economy which are very hard to read and very hard to run policies around. So what we've tried to do is offer up, if you like, a cushion. And the government has various programs to facilitate labor market adjustments, which I hope will make it easier for the economy to adapt. The economy has to adapt more than the policies, frankly.
Right.
But if we can facilitate that, that's a good day's work.
Right. So in our last remaining minutes, I think anybody who's ever thought about energy or has worked on policy, it's incredibly difficult to predict what's going to happen with energy markets. I don't think, certainly in 2008, we would have expected that we'd be building LNG export facilities because we'd had such a long conversation about how we're going to import. I think, 5 years ago, if you were to have said the price of crude is going to be less than $60 a barrel, a lot of people probably would have thought you were a little cuckoo. As a final question for anyone that wants to jump in, what do you think is going to be the next big transformation in the energy sector?
I'd do it quickly. I actually think storage technology will transform. Actually, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, unfortunately or fortunately, said in 1895, the development of storage technology will transform the power sector, and its development is just around the corner. Okay, so here we are. We're now coming around the corner, and I know at Duke we have 7 pilots of different battery technologies or storage technologies. I actually think it'll be used more in the context of creating a more resilient grid than used to smooth out the supply of renewables. So I think that will be very transformative, and as we reinvent the grid in the U.S. going forward, and as you look at what's happening in rural areas of the world, I think you can't underestimate the power of storage. And so that to me would be the number one technology that will transform, that is not in the calculus of a lot of people's thinking.
I'll go to technology too, and fracturing shale technology is old technology. It started in the 60s, but it was the directional drill that changed all of that a decade ago. Nobody saw that coming, and something out there today is waiting for us. And I suspect it's storage, but I also think it's probably big data. And the ability to monitor a neighborhood, a building, maybe a city, maybe a state, and control power usage in a much more efficient way, which today we do not do. I can remember my dad as a kid turn the lights off at night. We don't do that very much anymore. We have cheap energy, which is a good thing for us, but that allows all kinds of savings, and the technology unlocked there, I think, is really going to be exciting. It's the answer here.
You were your dad's app.
Yeah.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I think I think there's going to be 2 main technologies that are going to be very broadly deployed. One is off-grid systems, where a lot of people can cover their electricity needs without actually being plugged to grid. And second is offshore wind. Not maybe in the U.S., but certainly in developed countries where land is scarce, still need renewable, and offshore wind, I believe, will be a technology which price will go down dramatically in the next 20 to 30 years, and will be able to be a good solution for many countries.
Well, I got 2 points. I would certainly say the storage thing is one of the biggest technological leaps. And I just noticed I got a new BlackBerry. I only have to plug it in like every 3rd day. That's a way better battery than what my previous BlackBerry had. And it's because of that basic, we all want a better battery for our iPads or whatever. That's what makes that technology move fast, not because some plant wants better storage. And the other thing I'll mention is garbage. Garbage is a really important source of energy. We have lots of garbage. And harnessing that, I think, will be, I know there are technologies that are getting close to being really good at that. Not just the methane part, but actually disposing of the garbage so there's nothing left except energy and some distilled water. That's the kind of thing that could make a big difference.
Well, I want to thank you all for your time today. I think this has been a terrific conversation about some of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.